And the question was, like, for example, with reincarnation, how could you be judged only on one life if some people are born in rich places, some people are born in poor places, some people are born with resources, some people are born without those things? Shouldn't you basically experience all the different types and then be judged on all of them collectively? And the answer to that actually comes from the old catechisms, the way that it would describe things. The question that the Baltimore Catechism would ask is, in what way are all men and women created equal? And the answer was, they are all given a body and soul, they are all made in the image and likeness of God, and they all have received everything they need in order to meet their primary end, which is to know, love, and serve God in this life that we can be with Him in the next. Some people would say, if you're born in a rich country to maybe a family that's wealthy, that it's easier for you than someone who was born in a third world country who have absolutely nothing and no resources. I would disagree, because I've been in both places. I've seen the way people live in other places, and I've seen how the world is by being in those places with the people who live there. And I remember the first time that I experienced this, it was in Ecuador. And I'll tell you this because it'll make sense. When I went to Ecuador, I was with our community in Ecuador. We've been there for over 500, 600 years. And we saw extreme poverty. I mean, I went to places where the houses were actually concrete cinder blocks stacked up on top of each other without mortar for 3 walls and a tarp stretched over the top for a roof. And a family of 6 or 7 would live in a space that was probably 6 feet by 6 feet with no running water. They slept on the ground. They didn't even have a floor. I went one time with one of our priests there. We were only supposed to be gone for a few minutes. We were gone for like 6 hours. We went to the top of this mountain. I thought I was going to die going up the mountain. It was literally like this. And we're in this little Jeep, and I thought at any minute it was going to flip backwards and we were going to roll down the hill. And at the top, you had these little houses that were basically 3 walls with a tarp. And there was only one building that even had a roof, and it was the church. We stop in front of the church, and he rings the bell, and all of these children come running barefoot. And they have a little catechism lesson. In fact, I was the very first white person they'd ever seen in their life, because they don't have electricity, they don't have television, they don't live in a tourist area. And here you had this really tall giant, because the adult Ecuadorians came just below my shoulders, white and blue eyes. And they were always in my face because they couldn't believe that there's such a thing as blue eyes. All of their eyes are brown or black. The children on this mountaintop, they had 2 changes of clothes. The ones they were wearing and one more. And they would wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and they would walk without their shoes, because they would carry their shoes over their shoulders because they didn't want to wear their shoes out because they couldn't afford new ones. They would walk down that same mountain that we drove up. No road, it's like just mountainside. They would wake up at 5 and walk down the mountain. It would take them 2 hours to get to the bottom. They would catch a bus and go to school. At the end of the day, the bus drops them off at the bottom of the mountain. They take their shoes off and they go back up the mountain. They change clothes or whatever. Their parents are washing the other change of clothes while they're at school so that they have one that they're wearing and another one ready for school the next day. They had nothing, not even running water. But those children, always smiling, always laughing, always running around and joking. They were fascinated by everything. There were a couple little dogs and other things, and they would play with the dogs, and they were happy children who didn't go to school worrying about getting shot when they went to school, carrying backpacks that weighed 50 pounds of books, worried about what social media was going to say, what so-and-so said about so-and-so. Those children were not encouraging each other to commit suicide, like is what's happening in our schools today. When we went to this big church in the middle of Quito, it's one of the churches we've had since the 1500s. They call it the Convento Maximo. It's huge. It's like 4 times the length of this church. We're walking around looking at this beautiful building. And I noticed that in it, you had this beautiful door, and the door was probably 30 feet tall. It was massive. But around this tall, from the floor here to about here, there was this bar that was about 6 inches where it was cut out of the door all the way across, and they had a metal frame with little bars going all the way across it. I'd seen it in some of the other churches, but I noticed it there because you had this beautiful painting on the door, and it's interrupted by this hole that goes all the way across. And I didn't understand it. I'm like, why would you cut a hole in the door 6 inches across, all the way across, 2.5, 3 feet off the ground? It makes no sense. But as we're walking through and we're getting closer to the door, I heard something. I heard the sound of like voices or something, and we're alone in this church, just us. And when we finally get close enough to the door, you can see what's going on. The churches are locked because of fear of people stealing everything. It's a poor country, remember. But the doors are locked. There's a little vestibule area where it's marble floor. And outside that door, that locked door, there were 30 or 40 people on their knees praying the rosary. And when they were on their knees, that space, about 6 inches, was right at eye level. They could pray on that marble floor, on their knees, looking at the tabernacle in the Blessed Sacrament, giving thanks to God for everything they had. What American is going to kneel on a marble floor for 20 minutes praying at a door when they could have padded seats inside? They had nothing, and they were happy. They were faithful. They were loving. They would give you the food that they had with them for their lunch if you were hungry, and they would go hungry themselves to help somebody else out. And I thought to myself when I was there, that's why I'm telling you this story. They have nothing, but they're so happy. Their lives are full and joyful and good. And I got on a plane and I came back to the United States, where families don't even talk to each other. Everyone has their phone like this. They have access to so many resources and are living absolutely alone, in solitude, even when surrounded by people. They have medicine, they have access to so many resources and live empty lives that are vacuums where they just want to feel loved by someone, anyone, and don't. Selfish, materialistic lives.
But isn't that like what she was saying before, that living one life, one side or the other, it doesn't necessarily mean one side or the other is less, but you have the other opposite experience, so maybe you will be judged, the other way too. Like the extra experience might be a benefit to the person.
I would disagree, because I've also been to India. And in India, with the caste system, they will be dying in the streets, and they themselves will not accept help, because they believe that when they're reincarnated, they're going to have a better existence. I've seen people in those other places who hoarded what little resources they could. They had the same opportunities as everyone else in their situation, and rather than being giving and charitable and loving, they were selfish. In the United States, we have access to everything. We can choose to be kind, loving, giving, generous, and we can choose to be selfish. Why do I need to be born in different situations in order to experience all of them before God can decide if I'm a selfish person or if I'm a good person?
From perspective, a different perspective.
The perspective is always the same.
You're judged on your heart.
You're judged on your heart. And your heart doesn't change depending on if you were born in a big family, small family, rich family, poor family. It's your heart. And even if you put that heart in a different body or a different situation, the person stays the same. That's why the church says that it's only one time. And that's why I tell you this story about, Ecuador and India and other places, because the people who are good people, period. The ones that are bad people, period. And no matter how many opportunities they have to change, they usually don't. They can. They usually don't. How many times does God need to test us before He can decide if we're good or not? Even in one lifetime, how many times have we tried? How many opportunities do we have to do something good and choose not to, or choose to take it? Why do we need to have replays? 1,000 replays. I'm not trying to criticize. I'm just trying to give
My
examples.
whole life, and I think you just answered the question. I wondered it for years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad I was able to answer it.
Well, one thing here in the United States, we almost live in a vacuum. We have no idea what's across the rest of the world unless you get out into it.
You're right. In the United States, we are isolated and we don't know what's going on. And when we do go places, we go to the tourist areas where they speak English and they give American food and it's like a resort. I mean, you can go to a Jamaican resort and you'll have all kinds of luau's and all kinds of fun stuff. The average person who lives there does not experience that. So, moving on to this question.